So in this video, let's take a look at PowerShell functions. One of the benefits of a function is to modularize or put repeated functionality into a named space, which we can repeatedly call at will. So if we've got some particular piece of functionality that we're using over and over again, we can sort of parcel all that functionality into a function, and we can call that function whenever we need that functionality. That's a long-winded way of saying that we can do something over and over by just naming that something. Right, so let's just go to the next slide, and what you'll see here is the very basic syntax for a very bare bones minimal function. And we use the function keyword followed by the function's name, followed by a curly brace and 0 or more statements, and we close the function off with another curly brace. So here's some examples of functions. Here's a very simple function which says hi. We use the function keyword, the function name, which is say hi, and we output the string hi to the screen. So here's a little bit of a more elaborate example, and in this function we get all the process objects whose name is similar to Adobe. So let's try this out in PowerShell. So I'm just going to open PowerShell. What I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a function by beginning with the function keyword. I'm going to call this say hi, and I'm just going to put in the string hi. I'm going to close it off and press enter. So that is in a nutshell how we declare a very basic bare bones function. And in order to call that function, so let's say we're going to use that function repeatedly, we just say hi, enter, and as you can see the output is in actual fact hi. So what I'd just like to show you is we have tab completion. So now we've declared that function, we could partially put in what we want. PowerShell to find, and if I get say and I use tab, PowerShell intuitively or intelligently finds what I'm looking for. So let's move swiftly on, and here is the more elaborate function. So what I'm going to do for this function, I'm going to say function get Adobe, process. I'm going to open the curly brace, and then I'm going to issue a command called get process, and I'm going to pipe those process objects to the where object commandlet, and then I'm going to try and find those objects whose name is like Adobe. And then I'm going to close the function off. So I'm going to hit enter. And what do I've missed a curly brace, so I'm going to hit enter again. And in order to call that function, I just have to call its name. So Adobe process. And as you can see, PowerShell's returned all those process objects whose name is like or similar to Adobe. So one of the goals of creating functions in PowerShell is so that we get access to repeated functionality quickly and easily. But one thing to take note of in PowerShell is that even though we've declared these functions, they do not persist across sessions. So as soon as I close this instance of PowerShell or this window, I lose access to this function and I lose access to this function. One way to address that, let me just copy this first. One way to address that is to edit our PowerShell profile, which makes changes persistent. And the goal here is to have these functions persist across sessions so we can use them by just calling them whenever we want. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open Notepad and I'm going to point it to my PowerShell profile. I'm going to hit enter. And this is the Microsoft PowerShell profile, the user session profile. So everything what's in this file persists across sessions. So as you can see, I've got a function prompt, which changes my PowerShell prompt. So when I open up PowerShell, I always have this prompt here. I'm just going to close this off and I'm just going to get rid of this. And what I'm going to do is Control V, and I'm going to paste that function into my PowerShell profile. And as you can see, it's just the exact same function we declared earlier. And what this is going to do, it's going to allow me to use this function whenever I want in any instance of PowerShell. So what I'm going to do is Control S, save that. I'm going to get out of there, and I'm going to open up a brand new shell, and I'm going to type in get Adobe process. And before I do that, I might want to check this little error. So I'm just going to go back to Notepad, and I'm going to point it to the profile, and it looks like I'm missing a curly brace. So what I'm going to do is append a curly brace there. This is all good fun. I'm going to close out of here, and I'm going to close out of here, and I'm going to open a brand new shell. And by doing that, we should now have a persistent function across sessions. So in order to illustrate that, I'm just going to say get Adobe process with tab completion, hit enter, and as you can see, that particular function has persisted. So now we've declared a few basic functions. Let's see how we can get information into those functions using parameters. So what you'll see in front of you is the basic syntax for declaring parameters for our functions. Now, parameters are a way for us to get information or pass information into those functions. What you'll see here is two distinct ways to parameterize our functions. So let's start with the first one. What we do is we use the function keyword followed by the function name, and if you'll notice, this is the same, but we use the param keyword followed by the open parentheses and the closed parentheses here. Now what we're doing is we are using named parameters. So this is parameter 1, and it has a type. So this parameter 1 could be of type string, it could be of type double or type int, and we can also declare multiple parameters. So here you can see we've got parameter 2, and here is some alternative syntax. So what we've got here is the function, the name, and then we've got open parentheses, close parentheses, and similar sort of syntax. Very, very subtle differences, but in order to illustrate this latter syntax, what I'm going to do is just gloss over this example. So what you've got is a function keyword. We're adding two numbers. This is a very basic function, and what we're going to do is be able to pass in an integer or two integers into this function, and then we're going to use those values to return some sum of integer 1 plus integer 2. So let's illustrate this concept in PowerShell. So I'm just going to tab over into PowerShell. I'm going to clear the screen. What I'm going to do is just drag this up, and I'm going to go through this example here. So what we're going to do, I highly urge you to follow through, and if you can, type everything because it reinforces many of the concepts. We're trying to use multiple ways to learn, and the mechanics of typing code really does hit home a lot of these concepts, so I highly urge you to do that. So let's type in the keyword function. We're going to call this add numbers. I'm going to open parentheses, and then I'm going to use a typed parameter, and I'm going to call that 1. And similarly, I'm going to use a type integer, and I'm going to call that parameter 2. I'm going to close that off, and then I'm going to open the parentheses, and what I'm going to do is hit enter, and then I'm going to say $1 plus $2. So what we are in essence doing is we're adding this value to this value inside the function. So I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to close that function off, followed by enter. And if I call that function add numbers, then in actual fact we have no parameters because we have added no parameters to that function. So we have not given that function any arguments. So what I'm going to do is recall that again, add numbers, if I can type, And I'm going to say, let's do 2 and 3. So what do you think that'll be? It's a fairly trivial example, but we're adding 2 to 3, which should yield 5. So if I press enter, we do in actual fact get 5. To reinforce the concepts of parameterized functions, I'm just going to briefly revisit the function which we created earlier called getAdobeProcess. So let's scroll up. There we go. And to parameterize this function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add parentheses. You'll remember we need the parentheses. And I'm going to make this function accept a string, a typed value, or a typed parameterized value called name. So when we run getAdobeProcess, we're going to supply a name. The function is going to receive a name which we specify. Now, in order to make this function more versatile, instead of calling it getAdobeProcess, which is a very explicit and narrow-minded function, I'm going to make this function more versatile by calling it getNamedProcess. And the name is which we supply using this name variable. Now let's head over to this part of the function, which is hard-coded into the function. This is what makes this function less versatile. So every time we want to run this function, we can only ever search for process objects whose name matches Adobe or is similar to Adobe, sorry. So in order to make this function more versatile, what I'm going to do is a bit of PowerShell interpolation. And instead of having the string Adobe hard-coded into there, what I'm going to do is make a direct reference to that name variable. So what we've done here is we've made this function much more versatile. So now, instead of just getting the process names such as Adobe, we can get the process names which we specify. So to illustrate that, what I'm going to do is just press enter. Now, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and get the named processes that are called or have WMI in their name properties. And if I hit enter, we do in fact get 2 process objects with the characters WMI. And to further illustrate this function's versatility, I'm going to put in, say, SVC, hit enter, and you'll see that we get quite a few SVC process objects. And if we want to count those objects, we can store the SVC objects and we can make a direct call to that function with our SVC, and then we can call SVC objects and we can access the count property on that object. And we do in actual fact have 80 SVC objects, and if we were to individually count these objects, that's what we would get. And finally, to illustrate this named parameters in functions, I'm just going to create a function that finds all files less than a certain size. So let's call this function find tiny files. It's going to be a parameterized function, so I want this function to accept an integer called size. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to get the child item from the $home directory. And I'm going to pipe that to where object. And I'm going to say where the size or the length is less than some size which we supply. I'm going to close that off, and I'm going to close that off. I'm going to hit enter. And if I call find tiny files from within the home directory, I'm going to use the named parameter size. I'm going to say I want to find all files less than, say, 16,000 kilobytes, sorry. And as you can see, we have all the directories, and we do have a netTCP file, which is 15,213 in length. And let's say we want to find all those files what are less than, say, I don't know, 10,000. We should subsequently see that this is not returned because this is greater than 10,000. So if I hit enter, and as you can see, this is actually the case. And to wrap this section up, we're just going to talk briefly about default parameter values. So I'm going to hit up in the shell, get back to my function which I created earlier, get tiny files, but you will notice this time there is a slight difference, and that is in this section here. So what we've done is created a functional parameter called size, which is an integer, which is of type integer, but we have given this size variable a default value of 1000. So if we run get tiny files without any argument or any size value, and we hit enter, the function will put an implicit 1000 here, as if we were actually typing it in manually and putting in the value 1000. And if we hit enter, it will indeed get all those files within the home directory whose length is greater than 1000. So that wraps up the first section on functions. Stay tuned for the next video, which will go into more depth about functions. So over and out.